Well, welcome again, once again, to the fourth series of Future Insights on how to become a policy ambassador or a policy entrepreneur. Now, today it gives me great pleasure to speak with you in this last series during the holy month of Ramadan. I am Immanuel Azaad Moonesar, an associate professor here at the Mohammed bin Rashid School of Government in Dubai. I am also the program coordinator and head for the Masters of Public Policy, as well as I have been working in academia for just almost 2 decades. As of today, I have just about 195 publications, which includes journals, books, book chapters, policy reports, and so forth. And I'm also the president of the Academy of International Business for the Middle East, North Africa region. You can see the slide that's in front of you. This is my direct email as well. Feel free for any latest updates, which can be accessed via my LinkedIn. Feel free to connect, as well as my Twitter account. So everything, all these details are here, and feel free at any point in the near future to get in touch. I trust everyone is hearing me loud and clearly. I do have my eyes on the chat as well. So if you do have any burning questions, do not hesitate to type it in there. We will have a session where we will open the floor for questions and answers and so forth. And we do look forward to having your insights within this discourse at this point. Now, as mentioned earlier, before we start, we have a welcome poll. So those that are joining us, feel free to participate in this welcome poll. I have also posted the link. It's www.menti.com, as well as the code, which is 555997752. So you can enter that and answer this question throughout. Now, what we are hoping to achieve at the end of the next 40 to 45 minutes or so is to provide a basic understanding or a better understanding to you in terms of what is public policy, how is public policy made. It also will briefly talk about the various stages in public policy, as well as how best we can advance our understanding when it comes to the importance of stakeholder analysis and the theory of change. Now, in all of these three objectives gives us the overall understanding so as to help promote how to become a policy ambassador or a policy entrepreneur. We will also talk about what do we mean by policy ambassador as well as policy entrepreneur, and how this links directly with us as government workers, those are working in government relations, in the private sectors, and so forth. Now, what is public policy in itself? Some may refer to it in terms of who when we talk about public policy. What in terms of what is actually happening in terms of the particular issue at hand, as well as when and where and why and how. So when we talk about public policy, we are looking at these various elements in terms of addressing what is public policy. So when we talk about the who, when we are faced with some public policy dilemma or crisis, we will ask ourselves, who is this particular crisis or this story mostly about in terms of what is actually happening in this particular scenario? And when is this taking place? As well as the locality in terms of the location, where exactly this particular policy issue is happening. And then why did this particular crisis occur? And then how did this particular issue have unfaced? Now, to this session, we'll be talking about a few examples in terms of what do we mean of real case public policy scenarios and so forth. And I have one specific example that will really embody all of these facets. Now, what is public policy in itself? Some may refer to it as being what governments ought to do or what governments ought not to do, and what it does and what it does not do. One Christopher Simon quoted this in his book, The Social Contract, which brings public policy as a construct as depending on a social contract. Now, public policy by Laswell in 1963 also defined it as who gets what, when, and how. And here in the government of Dubai and the UAE at large, a public policy is the government's priorities and principles that are translated with a coordinated effort and series of various actions so that we can have some sort of desired changes, positive changes as a whole. The process in itself is quite a mix of an array of activities, projects, initiatives, as well as a variety of programs, all with the aim of meeting those strategic objectives as a whole. From your perspective, in terms of what is a public policy, and you can participate in that poll question. This brings about, public policy brings about, it comes about from certain triggers. And this is where we will be able to unface questions when it comes to the what, the who, and the when. So what triggers public policy as a whole? Now, one of it may be in terms of having, in terms of the government strategic directions, in terms of also your leadership priorities, federal requirements, as well as having some sort of budgetary pressures and constraints and so forth. Also, sometimes we may be faced with natural resources pressures, in addition to having some sort of crisis and emergencies, for instance, the recently pandemic, the COVID-19 in itself, in addition to external events that are occurring worldwide, regionally, and even within the country as a whole, which then brings around international events, as well as a lot of media attention. So these are all various tenets when we talk about the need for public policy. And these various tenets helps us to address the what, the who, and the when as a whole. Now, here in the context of the UAE as a whole, we have a public policy cycle which goes across 7 main steps. Now, for the purposes of today's workshop, I will just be touching briefly on each of these phases. This in itself is a 45-hour course on its own, so it would not be right to to unpack everything in this 40 minutes or so that we have. Now, what do we mean by the first phase when it's all about policy justification and framework setup? Now, this based on the triggers that we have been faced as a government, as a society, and so forth. Based on these particular figures and these triggers in its whole, this brings about some sort of policy issue or dilemma that we have been faced. Now, as a result of having this particular policy issue, we need to have some sort of policy justification, the reason or the rationale as to why do we need some sort of government intervention and work out that framework as a whole. So this is where those agenda setting will come into play, those priority setting exercises will come into play as well in the first phase as a whole. And this will be much more clearer shortly. I have quite an elaborated example to take you through. The second phase looks at how do we develop and analyze those policy evidence. Now, what do we mean by policy evidence base in itself? Policy evidence-based, you're talking about research reports, policy reports, evidence to inform the policy issue that's currently at hand. Similarly, if there's an alleged crime that has been taking place, evidence needs to be presented in order to come up for a decision of whether the person is guilty or not guilty. Similarly, in the context of public policy, we need to have those evidence to back those policy issues that we are wanting to address. Now, these may come in different forms and fashions. We are talking about, we may be familiar with perhaps analytical tools such as our SWOT analysis, where it is the evaluation of your internal and external environment, looking at your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities and threats as an organization as a whole. We also have the pestle analysis, which really focuses on your external environment, which looks at your political, your environmental, your socio-cultural, as well as your technological, your legal framework, and in addition to any sort of environmental factors that are being faced as a whole. Now, apart from these, and these are just two simple analytical tools, there are many, much more analytical tools when we are developing and analyzing the policy-based evidence as a whole. Some of us may know when we look at literature reviews, we look at the review of literature, we look at systematic reviews and so forth. We look at policy reports, news feeds and so forth. These are evidences that we can utilize in terms of assessing the where and the how of this particular policy issue that we are being faced with. Now, the third element as a whole, but before I go into the third element, one element that, which is the seventh stage, which is known as stakeholder engagement. Now, stakeholder engagement does not take place at the end of the process. Preliminary, many years ago here in the context of the UAE, yes, it was one of your last stages. However, at least within the last decade or so, stakeholder engagement has been across each and every one of these different phases as a whole. Now, once we engage with our stakeholders, and who are those stakeholders, it's very critical for us to identify these stakeholders that are being impacted by the policy, who can also work with addressing those particular policy issues and so forth. Now, it's critical also to highlight that at each and every one of these different phases, stakeholders will most likely be different, right? So when you are working in your first stage in terms of priority setting, in justifying the policy in itself, it's a various set of stakeholders. Similarly, when you are collecting the data, so for instance, in the first phase, you will mainly have policymakers, you will have advocators, you will have perhaps professional organizations, associations, and so forth. In the second phase, this is where you have your R&D personnel, your academic, your research institutes coming into play here and feeding information in this particular phase. And similarly, for phases 3 all the way to 6, you also will need to have those stakeholder engagements taking place. Now, going back to the third phase, which looks at establishing the theory of change. Now, what do we mean by the theory of change? Some of us may know the term change management, AKA it is change management as a whole. It's establishing those particular factors to limit the resistance to change. so that when you are planning for the execution or the implementation of this particular policy, it is important for us to identify what are the various measures that we need to best contain and manage the change, whether it may be in the form of incremental changes or radical changes, or even a mix of both as well. Now, our fourth phase focuses on identifying and appraising those particular policy options. Now, what do we mean by policy options? As a whole, policy options are those alternatives or solutions in helping to address that particular policy issue that has been identified in the first phase, as well as supported by your evidences and so forth. Now, in this particular phase, this is where we will be identifying all the possible solutions in terms of how best this particular policy issue can be addressed, taking into account that theory of change that we have established as a whole. So this particular aspect goes hand in hand with the evidence base. So in most cases, some of the practices, in addition to doing a SWOT analysis, your pestle analysis, and so forth, this is where we would be looking at best cases. We would be looking at best practices, benchmarking exercises. We will also be looking at case scenarios from the past that has been taking place, lessons learned from previous or similar experiences, and so forth. So this is where we will be identifying and appraising those particular solutions at hand. Now, once we have identified those particular solutions at hand, we will then have to streamline or prioritize and to see which of these particular policy options will be best suited for addressing this particular policy issue at hand. Now, there are a couple of factors that would come into play, and this is where in stage 5 or phase 5, where we design that policy solution and we plan for that implementation of that policy as a whole. Now, how does this designing of the policy solution look like? More or less, this is where we will be looking at the effectiveness, the efficiency, the practicality, the reliability, and how valid these particular policy options are at its best in order to address the policy issue at hand. Not forgetting doing a cost-benefit analysis as well. This is very critical, because in most instances, the number one questions the decision makers would ask, how much is this going to cost me? You know, and we know, of course, a price to solve a particular issue may be large. However, we need to be quite realistic in terms of how best we select those policy options and so forth, and make sure that it's quite viable when we look at the best policy solution as a whole. And in the 6th stage as a whole, this is where we would have rolled out our policy or implemented the particular policy. And this is where we will look at monitoring, reviewing, evaluating, and trying to look and to see whether or not this policy is working. Where do we need to make changes? Has there been some negative impacts as a whole that has taken place as a result of this policy? What are the positive impacts as well? And, you know, taking a stock as to why or as to the progress of how this particular policy is being implemented, and as well as in whether or not it is being addressing that particular policy issue as a whole. Now, at each of these phases mentioned earlier, you will have various stakeholders engaging along these various phases as a whole. So this is more or less this is more or less the policy cycle as a whole. We do have a quick question in terms of is the monitoring, evaluation, and review actually, if it's actually after the implementation. In the reality of the policy domain, in reality, it should be after the implementation, because once it's being implemented, this is where we will be monitoring in terms of the implementation of it, evaluate how best these particular policy options have been used to address the policy issue at hand, and review this particular policy as a whole. I hope that has made some sense, Mohammed. Thanks for your question. Now, also not forgetting, when we talk about policy making as a whole, public policy making has three basic components, right? Now, research, the literature, theory, it's quite diverse when we talk about these various elements. Some research would categorize the problem as an issue or as an agenda and so forth. But in the first, in one of the basic components is trying to understand what is the challenge at hand, what is the problem, what is the issue, what is being perceived wrong in the society or in a particular environment. Now, within the challenge itself, we would need governments to look at the delivery of their particular policy products. This can be in terms of regulations, it can be in terms of interventions, whether or not they are achieving the real impact, as well as are there many problems that the policies are meant to address as a whole. Also trying to identify any sort of capabilities needed to ensure that we need to have a positive impact as a whole, and to understand what sort of challenges are there as a whole. So it's really critical for us to keep this basic component or element as a whole. In the second aspect, this is where the policy in itself is a standing decision by the government. Now, policy in some countries may be referred to as law, it can be referred to as a guideline, it can be referred to as a mandate, it can also be referred to as a decree. So this is the standing decision of the government as a whole. Now, it's critical for us to understand that this particular key insight is quite impactful to the policy implementation. It's very critical for us to understand this, where, you know, many times countries do not invest in terms of building those positive impacts as a whole, rather than they focus on establishing those traditional administrative mechanisms and so forth. So it's important for us to look at the bigger picture, look at the insight in itself, where it's all about being able to manage the change, manage uncertainty, manage the resistance to that change in itself, manage those complex and diverse problems at hand, also manage the people and the politics that goes hand in hand. So it's really, really important for us to keep this in mind as a whole. And then in the final aspect, you know, looking at your policy direction as a whole, where it's the process, right? When we talk about the process of policy making, we've just went through those 7 main stages, where it's really about problem solving in the politics of that particular scenario or society or environment that you are situated, as well as making sure you have some sort of governmental framework as a whole, so that you can have a positive policy impact in itself, so that policymakers would need to apply those capabilities, where it's really focused on analyzing those problems, identifying and taking actions as a whole, reflecting on those actions taken, as well as making sure that we sustain those authority as a whole and building that legitimacy as well. This is very critical. In addition to, ensuring that we adapt and, reiterate that this particular policy impact, it is for the people as a whole, and it's to address that particular problem at large. Now, when we talk about evidence informed policymaking, this is where the why comes into place here. Now, evidence informed policymaking, it is an approach to the policy decision that aims to ensure that the decision making is well informed by the best available research evidence that's there. Now, as in many cases, think about if you are going on vacation, for instance, you put your family together, you said, okay, listen, we're going to go on a vacation. Where would we like to go? You identify a list of places. One of the factors may be, okay, we have a particular budget and so forth. We will do our research, whether it's safe, the costing, and so forth. We will have various parameters and so forth. Similarly, when we talk about policy decisions as a whole, we need to have those well-informed research evidence as a whole. Now, this is commonly categorized by systematic and transparent access to an appraisal of specific evidence when we talk about having an input into the policy-making process as a whole. Now, I know we've been hearing the word COVID-19 for the last 2 years nonstop. However, I'm not giving any examples on COVID tonight, right? But it's important when we went into COVID, in the case of COVID, we utilize evidence to inform the health policy making process so as to strengthen those health systems, drive those process and progress towards making sure everyone within that specific society or country as a whole receives some sort of universal health coverage, and as well as helping to deliver that promise of a better health for all. So this is really critical for us to keep in mind. The evidence in itself is really critical for creating that positive impact as a whole. Now, when we talk about policy ambassadors, so we've just saw briefly the policy cycle. Now, policy ambassadors can be defined as those individuals that are constantly engaged on the promotion of policies at the local, national, as well as the transnational levels. Sometimes they speak different languages and they live in different parts of the world as well. This particular concept was coined by a Porter de Oliveira just recently, just under 5 years ago, where he coined this particular terminology, policy ambassador. And in his initial research paper, he referred to policy ambassadors as ambassadors of participation. Now, earlier, if you can recall, I did speak about in terms of participating as policymakers in identifying those particular policy issues. Now, sometimes in a specific type of authority, it is much more present in one ambassador than another. Now, we will take you through and I'll give you an example. So what we mean by an ambassador in this case, let's take an example of promoting house or health policies. Now, if the ambassador has to promote certain housing policies, they need to have some sort of background on urban planning. If the ambassador this policy ambassador is promoting health policies, like for instance, here in the UAE, we've had Her Excellency Dr. Farida Al-Husseini, who was the official spokesperson for COVID-19 and speaking on behalf of the UAE as a whole. Now, in her case, she would be branded as a policy ambassador, where communicating all policy decisions mandates, initiatives, and so forth, and advocating the messages that are getting across various platforms and so forth. Similarly, in urban planning, someone promoting housing procedures and policies and so forth, having some sort of background in urban planning. They can also have a position at a university or college, so that they may be also an authority in both theoretical as well as practical as a whole. So this is very critical for us to understand the meaning of what we mean by policy ambassador. Now, policy entrepreneurs themselves, these are referred to as energetic persons who work with each other in and around policy making avenues in order to promote specific significant policy change. Now, if we go back to phase 3, which is establishing that specific theory of change as a whole, this is where policy entrepreneurs would come into play. Now, this concept has been coined in 1984 by Kingdon, who said policy entrepreneurs could be in or out of our government, in elected or appointed positions. It can be in interest groups or research organizations. But their defining characteristics, much as a case of a business entrepreneur, is their willingness to invest their resources, their time, their energy, their reputation, and sometimes money in its whole, so that in the hope of making sure a future is returned. So this is in terms of our policy entrepreneurs. And policy entrepreneurs fondly distinguish themselves being quite prepared to promote policy approaches as a whole that are very much new within specific contexts and societies as a whole. They often promote policy innovations by telling them new stories, creating new frames, and even making arguments that break down traditional alignments of interest and so forth. So this is the main difference between your policy ambassadors and your policy entrepreneurs. Now, which would you like to be? We do have a question from Ayman, providing an example in terms of the housing field. So specifically, if we have I don't know a professor in the field of urban planning as a whole. It's not coming to my head yet, but just to say, if a person is working on, so like for instance, we have the Sheikh Zayed housing scheme in the UAE. Now, to put this particular policy, and I believe, was it yesterday or the day before, there was a decree or an announcement of 1.6 billion dirhams being added to the housing scheme. Correct me if I'm wrong, if I did get that number wrong, but I believe that this would have been an announcement recently in terms of the housing scheme. Now, this in itself would, given that this particular initiative as a whole, taking into account providing funding to help support the housing scheme here in the context of the UAE as a whole, His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, the Vice President of the UAE and Prime Minister of the UAE, as well as the ruler of Dubai in itself, would be classified as a policy ambassador in itself, where he is heavily engaged in promoting policies at the local level, at the national level, as well as at the federal level, in addition to making sure that these various initiatives within the housing portfolio is being met not only through financials in itself and so forth. So I hope this just quick little example has been it's sufficed I will come back to the question shortly. Let me just to give an example of what we mean in terms of integrating our policy ambassadors and policy entrepreneurs when we talk about public policy in itself. I will take a case of a public health crisis in terms of obesity among children here in the context of the UAE. Now, many moons ago, the UAE has been classified as having very high rates, as being number 2 in the world for having high rates of obesity among children for quite some number of years. Now, the UAE in itself saw this as being an issue. Now, it has gone all the way back to 2009, where there was an article published in the National in itself, where UAE made an announcement where it's important for us to step up efforts to ban unhealthy foods in schools and so forth, where the cabinet in itself has announced this particular initiative. Now, at the same time, having high rates of obesity among children as a whole, this has become very much part and parcel, an issue and a public health concern within the context of the United Arab Emirates. Now, within the strategy, the National Agenda 2021, which was launched in late 2014, early 2015, the 7-year plan, there was one specific pillar which focused on health. And one of the specific objectives was to lower the prevalence of obesity among children. Now, this in itself entailed our agenda setting. It provided that opportunity for us to say, okay, we are being faced with an issue. We have high rates of obesity among the school children. And when we say children, we mean persons from the age according to the WHO's classification, as well as the United Arab Emirates classification, children under the ages of 18 and below. So these were persons falling within this group as being very much obese. On average, 2/3 of our children were obese as a whole. So this in itself provided that platform as being evidence to justify new measures and initiatives that needed to help lower the prevalence of obesity among children. So this has been made into the strategy and into the agenda as a whole. Now, as time goes by, in phase 2, it was important to gather the evidence and to look at the various initiatives in which policy options can be derived in terms of how best to contribute to lower that prevalence of obesity as a whole. Now, these two specific reports, just to put a disclaimer, it's not the only 2 reports on child obesity and policy interventions and so forth. As a School of Government, we have published a particular policy brief on the UAE's national agenda, obesity among the youth, and initiatives in how to lower this particular prevalence and so forth. Then later on was published in a journal where this was classified as a public health perspective. So these were some of those evidence that really contributed in terms of phases 2. Now, phases 3 and 4, where we look at the theory of change and identifying those particular policy options as a whole. This is where, in a specific area like this, a public health crisis, such as having high rates of obesity among children, this in itself would warrant for behavioral changes as well in mindsets and so forth, not only in children's mindsets, but also for their parents, their teachers, their guardians, the entire society as a whole. So the theory of change portfolio took place in many various facets. where the government intervention included ramping up programs and initiatives, ensuring public health campaigns for lowering the rates of obesity, where awareness sessions were done in terms of eating healthy, being a bit more active, and so forth. One of the policy options that was proposed in the policy briefs and the journal papers as a whole was a HEAL campaign, which was specifically on healthy eating, active living. HEAL, the acronym HEAL, where we are to heal our children from or helping to contribute to lower those prevalence of obesity as a whole. Now, so this in itself really took a form and fashion in terms of, creating that platform so that we can have those behavioral changes. So this came in the form of opinion pieces, newspaper articles in the context of the UAE. So for instance, a couple of years ago, there was an article published by the Khaleej Times looking at studies that looked at ways in which we can heal the concerns of youth fighting obesities, and really bring to light, look, this is a main concern. We really need to make an effort and put a few little steps in how to make our lives a bit more conducive and to make those changes as a whole. And as a result of this particular theory of change and the policy options as a whole, having that gauge from stakeholders, from the public, and one of the stakeholders being the public, just looking the reach and the sentiment as a whole to see whether or not this particular project or these initiatives by the government is being perceived positively or negatively. Generally speaking, it was positive as a whole, which then later on in 2019, I believe it was, or early 2020, the Ministry of Education launched a decree where it banned 9 specific types of food from the school. And this is where that fifth and sixth stage came into place, where we have those policy, designing that policy solution, implementation, and then monitoring and evaluation as a whole, review of the process, and ensuring that we have those stakeholders engaging at every one of those points as a whole. Now, and if we look at the start, if we take the first article, which was in 2009, and then almost a decade later, having one of those laws come into play, not to say that this was the only initiative. We've had many initiatives between the last 10 years in terms of trying to curb the prevalence of obesity as a whole. Now, so this is just one of those, small examples, as I would say, and, because of the time, we don't have the time to go into the nitty-gritty of it. But this is how that policy cycle as a whole really shows, and it showcases policy ambassadors, opportunities to be policy ambassadors and policy entrepreneurs as a whole in general. And I will come to the question shortly. Now, as in generally speaking, we have those once, how can you become a policy ambassador and policy entrepreneurs as a whole, apart from understanding the process, engaging in the problem, in problem solving and so forth, also engaging in local resources as a whole. Now having access to or engaging in the publications. And here at the School of Government, we do have many policy streams and initiatives specifically in theme-wise. And I think by now you would have gauged that I have a passion for health. Health is my background. So health policy being one of those main streams here at the School of Government, as well as social policy, well-being, happiness, looking at the overall quality of life, education policy, in addition to public leadership innovation, future government, and not forgetting the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So making sure that we have these main portfolios within the school. And this is not an exclusive list. It's quite inclusive of many other aspects as well. We also have economic policies, environmental policies, climate change, and so forth. We have various streams as a whole. Also engaging with local cases and textbooks and so forth. So these would be some of those examples where we have policy reports and our policy journals here at the School of Government, the Dubai Policy Review, where we have on a weekly, on a monthly or yearly basis as a whole, once the various issues are being published, it really unfaces the various policies within the context of the UAE, specifically in Dubai. One an example, how to implement policies with impact, a policy-making toolkit as a whole. So these are some of those local resources. This is not an inclusive list only, so there are many, many resources across the UAE, not forgetting those public events as a whole. So engaging with public events, whether it's policy forums, whether it's niche or health forums, conferences, education, urban planning, infrastructure, what may it be. These are quite critical for us to also engage, and these can be also evidences where we can gather and have those dialogues from these events as a whole. Now, remember, just a brief recap of your policy cycle. So having your justification, making sure we have evidence-based, establishing that theory of change, identifying and appraising those policy options, designing the specific policy solution in relation, as well as ensuring that we have that implementation plan, and then also monitoring, evaluating, and reviewing, keeping in mind stakeholders are engaging at every one of these various stages as a whole. Now, if you can remember the welcome pool, for those that I can give a few seconds for those that have joined in a little bit later. So this is the welcome pool. You can feel free while I look at some questions here. So you can go to the website, www.menti.com. The code is here. Alternatively, it's also posted here in the chat box while I look at a couple of questions in the meantime before we can see the real results coming up on the screen. So let's see, let's just take a question here, one from, we'll take a question from Doa, which states, do you think that policy entrepreneur can also be a policy maker since they are aware of needed changes? Of course, by its least, of course, certainly. Policy ambassadors can be your policy makers. So within the portfolio of policy making, you have many persons involved in the process. You have researchers, you have policy makers, you have advocates, you have lobbyists, you have ministers, you have government employees, you have director generals, and so forth. You even have the private sector that's also involved. So it is critical for us to keep this in mind, even though we are needing those changes as a whole. I hope that has answered your question, Doa. I'll take another question here. Let's see, what would be another one? Okay, how do you measure if the policy is being effective and implemented? Now, Galanini, sorry if I pronounce your name wrong. Now, this in itself is a good 4 to 5 hour lecture on its own. But to simply put it, this goes, it may vary from one organization to another in itself. Now, whether or not a policy is being effective and in terms of its implementation, this is where, when you are putting when you are in your phase, if we remember this, let me go back to this. If you remember identifying and appraising the policy option in itself. Now, once you have identified your specific policy option or policy solution as a whole that you would like to utilize, when you are designing that solution, you also plan for your implementation in itself. Within this portfolio, this is where you would have some checks and balances in order to evaluate your specific policy. Let's take, for instance, let's go back to the case of obesity, right? If we are to, how can we evaluate whether or not the initiatives, let's take the banning of unhealthy foods in the school. Now, this is a policy that came in recently. Now, the mandate in itself was decreed in 2015, late 14-15 for the National Agenda 2021. Now, the prevalence at the time was very much high. At the end of 2021, the prevalence of obesity has actually lowered from being at a very high number to a much lower number. Now, the prevalence rate was expected to be at least 16.5%, reducing from 48%. I believe it was 48% or 46%. I can't remember the exact figure from my head. But overall, it was in its 20s. So that rate in itself would have indicated the lowering prevalence of obesity. Now, this is over a 7-year process. Taking into account, we went into COVID. 2 years of that national plan was from COVID. So policymakers in itself, healthcare advocates and healthcare policymakers and ambassadors and entrepreneurs as a whole, they would be able to evaluate, look, given that we have had this significant drop in the prevalence of obesity in itself, we can say, yes, this particular policy has been effective. Of course, I am making it as simple as possible. It's not that simple. There are checks and balances, forms, there are documentations, there is rigor in making to check whether or not your specific policy is effective and is being implemented as effectively as possible. I hope that has answered your question. Now, I'm looking at the time. Let me just make sure it's loaded. Now we can see here the answer to the poll question: what is public policy? One of the top 3 words that comes to mind, we can see the government, we can see rules, we can see laws, we can see regulations, we can see guidelines, we can see principles. So these are some of the main words that pops to mind when we talk about what is a policy, public policy as a whole. And thank you everyone for participating in this particular poll in itself. Now, do you want to become the next policy ambassador and policy entrepreneurs within your particular place of work? Why not join us here at the Mohammed bin Rashid School of Government in Dubai in our Masters of Public Policy as a whole? As mentioned earlier, I'm an associate professor specifically in health policy and public policy, and I'm also the program head for the Masters of Public Policy. Now, our Masters of Public Policy in itself provides students that unique opportunity to develop those skill sets, those public policy skill sets, so as to, to make those intellectual and practical skills come alive, where students would much understand all of those various steps that I have just went through briefly, in terms of what is public policy, the various steps, the policy development, the administration of policies, the evaluation, the development of studies on itself, and so forth. Now we have 6 main specialisms. We have a general public policy, We have the social policy. We also have education, science and technology, health, and sustainable development as a whole. Now, within this particular master's, there are 6 core courses, 6 modules as a whole. You have to do 4 core courses, as we can see on the screen here. One of it is governance and public policy process. We also have research methods, which it really gets into phase 2 of your policy evidence base. Also, we have public economics and finance and microeconomics of competitiveness, which it helps us to understand those various concepts when it comes to policy making. And then you can specialize where, you have social policy. You also have education, health, science and technology, sustainable development. And these are the various specialisms as a whole. Now, then students would go into, providing that they have chosen one of these specialisms, they can then go and learn much more in terms of specific issues within those domains as a whole. And once you have completed all 6 modules, you then have a dissertation where we encourage students to problem solve a particular policy issue and have this as one of their dissertation topics, and to have a published research in itself. Now, basically our program, it can be either full-time or part-time. So as a full-time student, you can be anywhere from 12 months to 36 months, or a part-time student as 18 months to 16 months. Our Masters of Public Policy is heavily aligned with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We take our classes are on site, it's face-to-face. We also engage in offline activities through our online resources, our Blackboard, so students can continue working outside of the classrooms. We also give students that opportunity for capacity building outside of the Masters of Public Policy and in generally across all of our masters at the School of Government, where we continuously develop our students for academic skills, writing, research skills, and so forth, ethics, and many others as well. Students also have the opportunity to attend research seminars, guest lectures, and so forth. As a whole, we have no exams in the Masters of Public Policy. It's all based on project-based learning, critical analysis, and really trying to have students to have those real work examples as a whole. And students have that opportunity to publish their work as a whole in general. Now we have a few minutes, and these are some of the key dates for our Masters of Public Policy. So admissions, you can feel free to start your process now. Orientation starts on the 20th of August. The first day of classes will start. This is for the fall semester. Will start on the 27th of August. We also have a international field trip, which is still to be confirmed. Usually we take students to Geneva to give them that international global experience, that global governance experience. We take them to United Nations and so forth. Our enrollments, it takes place online or face-to-face on campus as well. And then the fall semester is hoping to be finished by the end of November. And then the next semester will then commence on the 28th of January, 2023. Can't believe I'm saying 2023 now. But yeah, so these are some of those key dates. We also have our admissions guide. These slides will be shared with you. So I know it's a lot of information to unpack. So feel free to go through these at your leisure, and don't hesitate to get in touch with us here at the Mohammed bin Rashid School of Government as a whole. I'll take any questions at this point. Do we have any specific questions regarding the, yes, you will have a copy of the presentation as a whole. Alternatively as well, I can also just drag and drop it here into the, I think I can do that, into the chat box. I don't think can I do that? In the meantime, do we have any questions from anyone? Okay, thank you, Marwa. Yes, I think I got it now. I'm sharing it now. Okay, so you should be able to download the presentation here, as well as the presentation will be attached with your certificate that you will be receiving shortly as well. Which book? So one of the resource that you could utilize, we have the public policy guide book from the from the Executive Council. This is made available for our students. In addition to our, you can feel free to visit our library, Zaina, here at the School of Government, where you can see this particular various examples of many other policies and so forth for the entire cycle. Plus, we do have a couple of resources published on our website under the research publications. We do have those there as well. You can have a look at those real case examples as a whole. Let's look and see any other present. So Yushra has happily put the online link for applying online, the enrollment online and so forth. So you can take note of that. But if there's no further questions, my emails are here. Don't hesitate to get in touch. You can connect on LinkedIn as well. We'd be happy to have you with us as within the School of Government as a whole as well. Okay, so we'll without further ado, I would like to wish you all a remainder of Ramadan Kareem. We wish you all the best. We wish that you have a great holiday. I know most of us are off for a couple of days for Eid. We also wish you to be safe and sound, keep wearing your mask, sanitizing and so forth. And we look forward to welcoming you at the School of Government. Regarding the library, Zaina, of course, you can feel free to drop by. We would welcome you at the School of Government. This would not be an issue. It would be totally fine. We're a government entity. We are open for the public. We are open for our citizens within the United Arab Emirates as a whole. Okay, so without further ado, I'll stay on just for a couple of minutes, but officially the session has been ended. Should you have any questions, any concerns, anything, I'm here just for a couple of minutes. Don't hesitate to get in touch. And thank you very much. Ma salama.